feeling on sharing about the grief medicine of the sweet water. So I'll acknowledge receiving some teachings through story from James Carpenter, and a few different pieces that I've learned from Haudenosaunee and Okwelme people around their sweetwater harvest and their ceremonies, and kind of connecting the dots around how this medicine is both very nourishing in terms of electrolytes and minerals and nutrients and all that, but also that there is this gift that the Natig Wata maple gives us to help us to let go and to release and process our own grief. So in a story that James had shared, he talked about how the winter camps in Doundo or Takaranto, Toronto, were a place where the peoples who weren't going to continue or couldn't continue to follow the herds and the flocks and the schools, they would stay here in this meeting place. And that winter camp had a special ceremony for those walking on, that the people could ask for their tea, as he put it. And it was an honorable process of being supported to walk on, to have that journey to the place of ancestors. And so when the people's returning, as winter waned and is warming up towards spring, were returning again, following those migrations of the four-legged and the winged ones and the finned ones, they knew that they were returning to this, a space that was energized by that winter camp and that walking on ceremony. And in understanding that the water, the crystals of the water holds energy, and that the water table that had accumulated over the winter from the snow and ice melting and holding there, that in the rhizosphere, the space of the roots of the Anatig, the leaders of the trees, that they're holding that water too. And that all that energy from that walking on, those walking on ceremonies were also held in the roots. And so there's something about an agreement with the trees to help them release as well by tapping them. So that's a long-standing agreement that we help them to process a kind of grief or do a kind of grief work through the land itself. And that in exchange, we too receive a grief medicine through the sap. And so when people talk about how it has a cleansing quality to it, that it can have a mild laxative effect, that it helps us to sort of shed our winter coat to get the rust and crust out of our bodies. And it also helps us to move through our grief. That for some can, with that intention, be a ceremony where we're connecting to our crying ceremony, which if we think of how that sweet water is dripping kind of like tears, and there's the release, and that release can be relieving, but it's a release of perhaps anguish, of frustration, of confusion, of disappointment, what have you. But that simultaneously there's that sweetness, that gift of joy. And there's a teaching about how our emotions are more complex than just a single feeling. That we might have anger that we can describe really easily, but underneath it are other kinds of feelings. And that simultaneous to those perhaps difficult feelings, we can have joy at the same time. So as a reminder, when we're having those celebrations of life to honor those who are walking on, we're sad, and we might have all kinds of other feelings too in that grief, and we can also have joy for them. We can also have joy at the same time. So there's there's so many ways, but there's a few ways that we can think about that grief work that happens. And so again, when we drink that sweet water and get that little zip of sweetness, that it brings us that immediate joy and that immediate connection to this long-standing ceremony and agreement with the Anatig Wata.